And what can be said about this game? Whew. It's the type of game that reminds me what separates the elite masters from other players. It's not just a level of play. It's not just your knowledge, not your willpower. The grind. That can what be said. I mean, if you had to put, I mean, this is my opinion. If you had to put your finger on one thing that separates, say, experts and masters, it's the grind. Taking a position that's roughly equal or slightly better and working that position for as long and strong as humanly possible. In the last chapter of Silman's complete endgame course from beginner to master, he dubs it cat and mouse. And cat and mouse, you've got to get good at playing it. If you can do it in 10, 20, 30, 40 moves, or do it in one move and do it directly, you want to drag it out. Now, why? Most people go, well, I can do it in one move. I'm just going to go ahead and do it. No, not in endgames. Because you want to wear down your opponent over time, especially if all they can do is passively defend. You're shuffling with a point, they're shuffling with no point. It gets numbing doing that for a long period of time, and you'll eventually crack. And this game is easily my favorite game of 2021, as the boss Magnus Carlsen shows with white that if you want it bad enough, you can make it happen. Let's dive right into this game, shall we? And we're kicking things off with the boss playing 1d4, which is getting to the point after we're seeing all these e4, e5 draws. d4 seems like the way to go in World Championships these days. So Fischer, best by test. There's an extra question mark on that one now. d5, g3. And I thought when I'm watching that we're going to get another Catalan. You know, if c4, we're going to have, say, a repeat potentially. But Magnus is just looking to get a game. He plays b3. And this kind of falls under Pseudo-Catalan territory. It's not quite a Catalan. I mean, I've even gone so far as to kind of dub this like an automatic line. Just want to play knight e2, bishop e2, e3, c4. And Nepo with black plays exactly what I suggest in my Openings Oddities course, c5. You want to play against the center immediately before white has time to get everything that he wants. Say, for instance, the main line here is bishop b2, takes, knight c6. And with a little bit of time, black is going to be able to get a colors reverse Grunfeld position and have the superior pawn structure with more space. So I really like Magnus's decision on move 7 here with d takes c5. And now c4. And some would go, well, how about we mess up the pawn structure? And I completely understand. And here, black can't mess up the pawn structure further, grabbing on b3 as the bishop would hang. So queen e7. But here's a pivotal moment in understanding. Because those who are too materialistic look at this position and go, that's a pawn. Give me the pawn. Well, understand, and let's define what a gambit is. A gambit is giving up material for more time. And when you're playing white, you already start with more time. You already have your first move, edge, and initiative. In this case, this is a very Grunfeld type idea. I'll notice this as I'm studying Grunfeld lines. I'll see colors reversed, we have very similar positions. Black will give up an extra pawn in order to accelerate development to really start to put pressure on white. And here, white already has some pressure, so it's going to intensify. So what happens if a pawn is grabbed? Nepo in the game did not elect for this option, but if takes, knight takes, putting pressure on the bishop. And I figured for bishop a3, to try to alleviate some of the extra time, but how quickly does it become difficult for black? Knight e5, takes, And this line was a good example. I mean, I don't know that Magnus wouldn't have tried to keep the tension somehow after knight d7, maybe knight c4. As I'm looking at it, like this was the engine's, say, first choice for many of these moves. I feel like he would have kept tension better, and I mean, I'm seeing ideas like knight c4, knight d6, and after, say, both rooks coming to the d and c file. So that type of line seems really, really difficult to play, and that's why this move after knight bd2, c takes b3 is not played. Accelerated development, case in point. Remember, there are 3 advantages in chess: time, material, and quality. Everybody knows material. Oh, I got extra guys. But time is not seconds and minutes on the clock. It's the extra move, extra 2 moves that make a difference. And you start the game, if you get 4 moves in a row, you can beat your opponent immediately. So that kind of puts the evaluation of, or the value of time, I should say, in high esteem. And then quality. Quality is options for your pieces for both attack and defense. If I was to take this queen and put it on h1, the queen has very little quality, as a queen that has many, many options is a far superior piece. So anytime you can keep your opponent's pieces poor, you're doing a good job. Like right now, this is probably the most difficult piece to work with in Black's camp. So let's keep going based on a couple of these little points. So knight c6, we'll grab with the knight, and on b5, knight c to e5, knight b4, and queen b2. You go, well, isn't the bishop supposed to go there? Well, Magnus has got other ideas for the bishop. And after bishop b7, a3, go away. And when I saw this position on the board, I was like, all right, we're about to get an imbalance. And this excites me because we've been having these, like, especially when Nepo has been playing the a4 lines in the anti-Berlin. I'm like, those are the types of games that would have made Fischer, if Karpov and Kasparov were playing it, go, oh yeah, every single match, yep, it's prearranged, it's agreed beforehand. It's that type of game that he was complaining about because it looks mechanical. Because it's nothing but computer prep, and they're just, if I was Magnus, I'd be happy with making draws. So with Black, so yeah, sure, let's do it. But this is a position that it's a good point to pause your video and try to figure out how Magnus can create a concrete imbalance here. All right, let's continue. Knight d3, because we want the bishop pair. And now bishop g5. And the point of the queen being on b2 is now seen. We'll be able to capture on f6, which creates an imbalance. Now, it's interesting because there was a chess-based DVD years ago by Grandmaster Daniel King on minor piece imbalances, or it was some endgame course. And I remember it was definitely Kramnik was pressing against the doubled f-pawns, and it was knight versus bishop. And he was able to show in that game that with clinical play, the knight beats a bishop with the pawn structure that Black has. So let's kind of focus on what we're angling for with White at this point, because I want to get to a favorable ending. So let's make some trades, and then we're going to focus on the pawn structure. And as we get to a position after knight d4, Black's trying to alleviate some tension and pressure. So okay, queen a2. There goes the bishop pair, and now the dust is starting to settle for the type of position that we're looking for, knight versus bishop, a concrete imbalance with the double pawns for Black. So if we were to take off all the heavies, this should be a straightforward win for White. Let me close this door. had a little drip drip sound from a faucet. Didn't want it to pick up in the recording. So if we take off all of these heavies, the goal with white is to start putting all of his pawns on the opposite color of black's bishop, as they won't be targets. So I would be looking to play a move like a4 to assure that the pawn on a3 is not a target. Start looking for potentially e4, f4, f5 to make sure that the pawns stay doubled and remain targets for the rest of the game. And it also should be noted, if there's an opportunity to trade the knight for the bishop, which doesn't fix these pawns, that there's a Capablanca king and pawn endgame where you put the king there, the other king is defending, and you can eventually break through and win by pushing all the pawns up and basically trading on g6, as the king is going to have the better position and can run over and gobble everything up. So, and I want to point these things out because notice how I'm talking about endgames that I've studied before, and I've got snapshots. Like, I don't remember the exact details. I'm not like one of these great players, like 100 endgames you must know. Yeah, I can do the endgames, but where was the first time this game occurred? I've noticed that with great players, the first time I experienced it was at the Emery Castle chess camp with Grandmaster Yuri Shulman. And they showed him positions, like famous moves, or actually they didn't even show him positions. They asked him, if you had to name the 100 most famous moves in chess history, like go, name the games. And he was able to name like 60 games off the top of his head. And that was so impressive to me. And what I found is that some grandmasters have such an excellent memory for it. And it's kind of like how I would say the average person can retell the plot of a movie or a book to a friend. That's how they perceive these types of games. But I digress. I find that interesting, but you should definitely have mastery of basic endings so you know where you're trying to go. Well, of course, both of these players understand what's up with the position, and Nepo's keeping tension. a5, and I believe this is a good move because now we're going to have the opportunity at some point to make a push. So what is black looking for? a4. So when the pawn pushes, the pawns will be secured on the same color as the bishop, so they can potentially be a target in the future. Or we want to try to get white to push this pawn at some point. So again, securing targets for the future. Both sides, when there's an imbalance, is constantly jockeying to make their minor piece better with these little things to be noticed. So rook ft1, king g7, rook d2, and we're looking to continue pressure. And now Nepo goes for a concrete imbalance, which arguably this could be the thing that loses him the game. And a lot of people go, ooh, I don't want to give up my queen, but let's take stock. Typically, two rooks are better than a queen because the two rooks can make a target together. As long as your king is safe, typically two rooks is going to be better than a queen. And this is a roughly equal position according to the engine, but I would take white all day long without hesitation here because white can make targets eventually. You have to have patience, you have to have grit, and you got to be loving the grind. But white's better. Queen d5. And this position is hard to evaluate because the A pawn and B pawn will get weak at some point. It's definitely going to happen. E3. Every pawn is on the same color as the bishop. So that's definitely a favorable imbalance for black. So we definitely need to perceive this and go, before trading the queens, before playing rook d2, you have to properly evaluate that you're okay. Because if the A and B pawns fall, and black has two runners, we're dead lost. And you know at some point, these pawns are going to fall. You're probably going to be able to grab one of his in the meantime. Can we hold that position and eventually make progress? And I believe Magnus was able to look at this position when he captured on c8 and see the long-term dynamics and go, yes, I'm fine. And we're going to get what we see in the game eventually. So h4, king h2, rook c5. No way to defend the a-pawn, so we need to get some play elsewhere. And rook d1. And this move is going to be important as we're making a threat right now. It's subtle, but we're making a threat. So takes, takes. One set of pawns have been exchanged. Now rook c5. Need to watch out in some lines for e4. Now we have knight b2 in the event of e4. Rook d to d2. Now the knight can move. And it seems when we get to this point, good move, knight takes e4, that black with the outside pass pawn should have enough to hold. And when I was looking at this position, I thought surely the white pieces are tied down to needing to worry about the a-pawn. So when I saw a3, like, okay, knight f4, rook a2, I didn't immediately see a way to make progress. Admittedly, I was analyzing games in Orlando at the grade level nationals for Chessable, and I didn't have a lot of time to really go in depth in analysis. I just thought this Magnus got an imbalance. He's trying to work in the position. He's definitely going to play this forever, but I did not think the game was going to be a win. And this is very instructive because every single one of white's pieces is better than black's. And we have that type of like Fischer-Bayern game of the century where if the queen doesn't have any targets, it's not really a queen. And we're going to see gradually over time, understanding favorable imbalances in the endgame is so important here to maximize winning chances. So bishop b4, hitting the a-pawn again. Now everybody's piled up on the a-pawn. And see, this is where I thought, okay, bishop just goes back and forth. No real risk, no real worries. I'm just going to zigzag my bishop back and forth. And I figured this was going to be a draw. But then the queen eventually leaves the pawn with queen e4. And I think Nepo underestimated this next move. Because had he kept his queen tethered to the pawn and just moved the bishop back and forth, I felt that it keeps the rooks bound. So the rooks and queen kind of cancel out. The knight can't do it alone. Should be a draw. But this moment, this had to be a splash of cold water. Because rook takes a3. And you go, oh, well, why not bishop takes a3? And this line did not happen in the game. But the knight and rook are far better than the queen here. So let's give a brief line to see. Queen, rook b3, rook b5. I've got my rook on the 5th rank hitting this h-pawn. And after a move like queen e4, I'm looking at some point to go knight e2, knight f4. A pawn falls. We get the rook out of the way. We start pushing at the right moment of the h-pawn. And again, the queen doesn't have targets. So this is playing for 2 results for white. And it's a miserable position to try to defend against a brilliant endgame player like Magnus and a grinder like Magnus. And check was played in the main game because of the pin. And queen e4. So now I would say we're beginning a brand new game. And it was roughly 8 hours of play. And Magnus, in a later interview after the game, stated that he wanted to wear down his opponent, and he felt like he could win by doing that. If you don't like the grind, if you don't like these types of positions, because I saw in particular one master on Facebook, actually a couple of masters on Facebook being like, well, that was so boring. Yeah, he won, but Like, you're going to complain if he makes draws. You're going to complain if he grinds out a win in this way. Oh, maybe you just shouldn't play chess then. Because this is chess with this style of play. Solid players have to grind out wins in this way. So if you don't like this, you can play for tricks and gambits and try to beat your opponent in the middle game with tactics. But I'm going to go with the real chess players are having to do this because tricks and tactics only work to a certain level. Surprise value definitely will catch good players every now and then, but there's a reason in these World Championship games with excellent preparation how they're so easily making draws. This was the best shot at winning for a reason. I think it's the best way to technically play chess. So let's get to it. See these slow improvements over time. And we're going to need to cover our base pawn and make some targets. So let's block the check. F4, get that bishop from defending the F6 pawn. No weaknesses, cover all the bases. Okay, E3 could be a problem. Rook E4. Now the rooks are connected while defending that weakness on E3. And no hurry here. Okay, a check is threatened. We'll just take it away. Now we're still covering the weakness, but keeping an eye on F5. No hurry at all. A little bit of shuffling. Finally, Nepo tries something different. Rook B1. And here, I believe Nepo missed a key moment to try to get some drawing chances. See if you can find it. This is a good pause your video to try to figure it out. Okay, the most forcing move here is H4. And after takes, Bishop D8, a very difficult move to find. And one of the engine lines is recommending giving the rook back to again play that knight versus rook type ending. But the king is far more open than he was in the previous line where we saw on rook takes A3 if bishop takes A3. So I think this is far more difficult for white to win, but of course Magnus would press forever. Okay, in the main game, bishop A7 was played. And we continue this shuffle game. And you've got to patiently wait. And you'll eventually get an opportunity. E3 is no longer a double hit. Rook takes F7. And we've got our knight and rook versus queen ending. If the G-pawn is traded for the H-pawn, we'll have a knight and two connected pass pawns and a rook versus a queen. Everything is together, so it's optimized. So let's see. We're on move 82 now. This is a 136 move masterclass in grinding out a win. And I find it absolutely fantastic. And many of these moves, you have the point of what you want to do eventually, but there's no rush to do it. Remember initially in the video I talked about the concept of cat and mouse. We're trying to optimize and make sure that there's no perpetual checks before ever starting to push the pawns. There's no hurry. You can play 49 moves before pushing a pawn. And it's at that moment, this is where the commentators are like, all right, he shuffled around for about 20 moves. Now he's showing he's trying to win again with E4. Like, I would have shuffled some more, in fact. I would have shuffled, like, this is where, in FIDE, you got 30-second increments, so you have to take notation the whole time. But in US chess, I'll do tally marks to show how many moves it's been on my score sheet in order not to hit the 50-move rule if I'm grinding like this. Rook D7, Rook D4. Finally, that pawn gets traded. The move counters reset, 50 more moves. And we need to get our king to a place where he's not going to be checked infinitely. All right, got it. Now we're looking to push the pawn. Finally, we get some progress pushing our pawns. Of course, if queen takes rook, check. And with the barrier here, we will easily be able to get opposition, and we can waste a tempo with a knight at any point in time, so there's nothing to calculate. This is a forced win for white. So rook f7 here, and on king d8, f5, and knight g7. And this had to be a heartbreaker for the challenger, as it's clear once the king gets safe from a few minor checks, more than likely it's walking up in this way. There's no more checks, and the pawn goes without difficulty. For the longest excuse me, world championship game in history, like a boss, Magnus Carlsen breaks the drought of 5 years, 5 long years without a win in a world championship. And this is a great one to break the drought, a record breaker. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, like and subscribe, and join us for the next world championship game.